The Sanballat Dynasty is the topic for the Bible study this morning. Now, everybody got the document? Anybody didn't get a document? Okay, now, let me just say one thing about this Sanballat Dynasty. I talked to you once before when I had the Bible study about the King Herod dynasty. Remember? There were 6 men who were relatives, the 5 men who were relatives of Herod the Great. And they were all in the Bible. But now, with the Sanballat dynasty, it's going to be just a little different because there were 3 men in the Sanballat dynasty. And if you will take your handout and look at the page 1, right in the middle of the page is a flow chart that shows who they were. And at the bottom of the page, there's also another flow chart that tells who they were and who their children were. And so much for what I'm going to talk about. Now, on your handout, there's 4 points, and you can see them in yellow. See that on the far left, in the very middle of the page, there are 4 sources for this document that you have that are highlighted in yellow. One is Nehemiah. He talks about Sanballat the first. There's a relative of Sanballat named Delilah. And see the red number 2 by his name? He's the second source for the Sanballat dynasty. And then over on the left-hand side of the page, see source number 3, the Samaria papyri. I think I skipped. Go back up to 2. There's a document that's called, there's some text called the Elephantine papyri. That's for the source number 2. The Samaria papyri is the source for number 3. And then Josephus, drop down to the bottom, the Jewish historian Josephus in yellow, he's the source for Sanballat the third. Now you can see at the very bottom, there was Sanballat, his son Delilah, he was a governor. There was Sanballat the second. Now, let me stop and say this. Only Sanballat the first is in the Bible. None of the rest of these men are in the Bible. But they were out there, and there's information about them in written sources that are available to anybody that has an interest in this. Okay, back to the bottom of the page. There was Sanballat the first, his son Delilah. Then there was Delilah's son, who was Sanballat. He was Sanballat the second. Then there was Sanballat the second's 2 sons, Yeshua and Hananiah, number 4 and 5. And then there was Yeshua's son named he was Sanballat the third. Now, one of the major problems when these Sanballats are mentioned, they don't have a Roman numeral beside their name. You have to know what they're talking about, Sanballat the first, second, or third. But anyway, notice the introduction at the top of the page. Now I want to read this to you, and just follow with me in your document, okay? So really the introduction, and there's 4 points in this document. Sources 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's a conclusion. So there's really 6 points to make in this little document. So first of all, the introduction. There were 6 governors in Samaria in a 114-year period between 445 BC and 331 BC. Now, I know you might be asking, well, what is so important about 445 BC and 331 BC? Okay, well, let me tell you. 445 BC was the year that Nehemiah made the return back to Israel with a group of people. That was the third return, and he met a man named Sanballat that gave him a very hard time, to say the least. Now, last week when Brother Jim Malouf had the Sunday school lesson, I asked Jim if he would ask y'all to read the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. The little short books in the Bible, they're not real long. Ezra's 10 chapters, Nehemiah's 8. You can read them both in about half hour. But anyway, they talk about Nehemiah, the three men that returned, the three groups, when King Cyrus let them return. So much for 445. Now, 331 BC is the date that Alexander the Great finished conquering the known world, and he met a man in Judea named Sanballat, but it was Sanballat the third. It wasn't Sanballat the first. There was 114 years in between Sanballat the first and Sanballat the third. It would be impossible for him to have been the same man. But so much for the dates. There were 6 governors in the 114-year period between 445 and 331. Now, all these men were relatives of Sanballat the first, who was the governor of Samaria when Nehemiah returned in 445 BC. Now, this fact has given Bible scholars a lot of problems trying to figure all this stuff out. That's just to say the least. But the reason why is because there were 3 Sanballats, and they had a practice back in that day and time, and we still do today, of naming our children after their grandparents. Now, you can see on this document right here, a perfect example of it. And I'm going to show you another one too before we finish today, if we have time. This practice is called paponymy. You may have heard of it, naming your children after their grandparent. But anyway, there's many examples of it in the Old Testament. The first century historian Josephus, who lived from 37 AD to 100 AD, wrote about Sanballat III, who was the governor of Samaria in 331 BC, and a lot of Bible scholars think Josephus was wrong in what he wrote, that he was misinformed, he didn't know what he was talking about, and it's been proven now that he did. Let me tell you something. I started college in 1962, and that was a landmark year because in this document you'll see here, something happened in 1962. The discovery of the Samaria papyri in a cave 10 miles north of Jericho. And we're going to talk about that. And I have one of the best Bible dictionaries money will buy. And it went to press in 1962. And under the topic Sanballat, the guy who was writing the article come right out and said that Josephus was not telling the truth, or he didn't know what he was talking about. That man has been proven wrong. Josephus knew exactly what he was talking about. But anyway, the writings of Josephus concerning Sanballat have been clarified a great deal since the discovery of the Samaria papyri. Now, you may have heard of the Samaria papyri, the Elephantine papyri. These are just a bunch of writings, scripts that have been discovered in certain places. Very important documents that talk about what happened in the Bible. They're not books of scripture. They just talk about what happened in the Bible. Now, the discovery of the Samaritan papyri was in 1962 in a cave. The cave was in an area called the Wadi Ed Dalia, about 10 miles north of Jericho. Some people say it was 10, some people say 8, some people say 12, but it was north of Jericho. How far it was doesn't matter really. But the Samaritan papyri clearly mentioned a governor of Samaria. That was Sanballat II. It would have been impossible for him to have been Sanballat I because the time element would have made him 150 years old. There's a lot of reading in between the lines in what I'm saying to you today. But anyway, this Sanballat II, he lived during the time of King Darius III, just about the time when Alexander the Great was fixing to defeat him. And that took place in 335, between 335 and 331. Now, this Sanballat had two sons who were also referred to in these writings that they found in that cave, the Samaritan papyri. They mentioned this Sanballat, governor of Samaria, and his two sons. That was Sanballat II. It would have been impossible for him to have been Sanballat I that Nehemiah met, because he would have had to have been 150 years old. Well, Josephus was writing about Sanballat I and not the third. And another thing that confuses things is two of these Sanballats, Sanballat I and Sanballat III, they had relatives with the same names. Now, you talk about a coincidence. That's something else that made Bible scholars think that Josephus, the historian, had got them confused and that he didn't know what he was talking about. Well, that was just a coincidence, but it's a fact. Well, now, the first item in this handout here that I'm going to talk to you about that talks about Sanballat I, the children of Israel were allowed to return to their homeland in 538 BC by King Cyrus. When King Cyrus became the leader of the known world, he let the Jewish people return to their homeland. They returned in three different groups. The first group that returned was under a man named Sheshbazzar. I know that's not exactly what you would name one of your children, and it's not exactly a household word, but you remember that, Deborah, next time you want to name your grandkid Sheshbazzar. I had a friend that was one of my neighbors and named his son Caleb. Caleb and Joshua, you do remember those two, okay. First, and that man has a relative, is a member of our church, Barbara. He was our neighbor. He's Bud's brother. I can't remember his name. What was it? I can't hear you. But he was a good friend of mine.
It was Morris.
Who?
Maurice.
Maurice, yes, Maurice. He was my neighbor. Bud Stonecipher's brother had a child named him Caleb. How old is he now?
He's just right at 20, 21. He's in the Navy.
21 years old now. I remember when he was born. But anyway, Maurice's house, his backyard faced my backyard. Now, Sheshbazzar, he led the first group back to Israel. His name is also called, he has another name, that won't come to me right now. And it's also in the book of Ezra, Zerubbabel. Now, this has caused a lot of confusion in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Why was he called Sheshbazzar? And then a few verses later, he's called Zerubbabel. And this Zerubbabel, he's mentioned in the books of Haggai and Zechariah also. Haggai and Zechariah are two books that fit right in with Ezra and Nehemiah. Because this Zerubbabel, later on, he became the governor of Judea, and he was also a prototype of the Lord Jesus Christ that you'll find out if you read the book of Haggai and Zechariah. Zerubbabel. Now, the Babylonians did this to people. When you went to Babylon, they would change your name. Zerubbabel's Babylonian name was Sheshbazzar. You remember Daniel and his three friends when they took them captive to Babylon? What they do? Change their name. Daniel had three friends with him: Mishael, Azariah, Hananiah. They changed their names to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel's name was his Hebrew name. They changed his name to Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar was the name of Nebuchadnezzar's god. And they gave that to Daniel, and they gave Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. Did you hear about the little boy who went home from church and his daddy asked him what was the Sunday school lesson about? And the little boy told his daddy it was about your shack, my shack, and Abednego, and about a bungalow. Your shack, me shack, and a bungalow. Well, the little boy got one right, Meshach. But that proves that they changed their names. Okay, Sheshbazzar was the first one to lead a group back. Okay, a few years later, another man named Ezra, he led a group back to Israel. And then there was Nehemiah, he led the third group back. And when Nehemiah led the third group back, that's when the problems began. Nehemiah confronted this man named Sanballat, and Sanballat really gave him a hard time. Now, if you'll go to page 2 in your document, this is the first source for Sanballat, the Sanballat Dynasty, number 1. Now, King Cyrus gave this first decree in the year 538 to let the Jews go back. And Sheshbazzar, he led 42,000 of the Jewish people back to their homeland to build and their main goal when they got back was to rebuild the temple, which they did in 20 years. Now, you notice in parentheses I have here underneath of that first group, King Darius, who succeeded Cyrus, he led a group back to Israel too. But it wasn't considered a return as such like the others. It was just a reinforcement of the first return. And I don't really count it as a return. If you do, there would be 4 returns recorded in the Bible instead of 3. Well, that's a moot point, but I just put it in there. But the second person who led a group back was Ezra. This was in 458 BC, and this was 80 years after Ezra had led the first group back. And then there was a third group that returned, led by Nehemiah in 445 BC. That was 13 years later. This is when he met up with this man named Sanballat, who really gave him a hard time trying to rebuild the walls of the city. Now you notice the little diagram here to the left. See that city? See the old city right there? That's what you would read if you read the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah chapter 3. Nehemiah's midnight ride around the wall, inspecting all the gates. That's a good little map of his what he's seen and the names of the gates. This little map covers a multitude of sins. You ever heard that? But anyway, Sanballat decided to stick his nose into the business of Nehemiah. Now, what business was it of Nehemiah what business was it of Sanballat if Nehemiah wanted to help rebuild the walls? It wasn't none of his business. He was the governor of Samaria. But guess what? For all practical purposes, this Sanballat was ruler of the whole area. Because all the Jewish community Jerusalem had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and all of the Jewish people taken to Babylonian captivity. That only left the surrounding nations of Edom and Moab, and the Philistines, and Samaria. And this man, Sanballat, he was ruling the roost, so to speak. He was the king bee. He didn't want anybody interfering. So when the Jews showed up with Nehemiah and they were going to rebuild that wall, this upset him greatly. And he plotted to try to kill Nehemiah. That's serious business. But the Lord delivered him out of his hand. And, this King Cyrus that let the Jews go back to their homeland, did you know that the nation of Iran, which is where it was Persia up until 1935. Iran was Persia. They changed it from Persia to Iran. That's almost in my lifetime. I was born in 1937. 2 years. But they claimed that Persia was just a district in Iran, so they changed it. And there was a man, now this was in my lifetime, you remember the Shah of Iran? He was a friend of Persia was an ally of the United States. These bunch of crazy people in Iran, I don't know what else to call them, they're Looney Tune, the Ayatollah nutcase, who, whatever his name is, the Ayatollah Khomeini nut job, they threw the Shah of Iran out of his country, and he had to take asylum in Egypt. He's dead now, but he was a friend. Jimmy Carter was a president when they did that. And they threw him out of the country, and they took over. And they are running it into the ground right now, and President Trump is squeezing them so hard. Their economy's collapsed. They don't know what to do. That's another lesson for another day. But they believe in the coming of the 12th Almighty. I don't know if you know anything about that or not. That's an interesting study. Get on the internet and check it out. That's kind of like our belief in the second coming of Jesus. They believe it's going to be a worldwide calamity first, and then the 12th Almighty is going to come, and he's going to usher in worldwide peace. But anyway, so much for Persia. This man, King Cyrus, he is called in the Bible, he is called the Anointed. He's the only non-Jewish person to ever have been called the Anointed. Isaiah was a prophet. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1, Isaiah prophesied that The Jews were going to Babylonian captivity, which they hadn't gone into. When Isaiah wrote, the Jews were still in Israel, and he predicted that they would be taken into Babylonian captivity, and a man named Cyrus, who would be the king, would let them go. That was 140 years before it ever happened. You know, I'm surprised you don't hear a lot more about this. But anyway, that was King Cyrus, and he let the people go. Now, what I've talked to you about so far is the biblical angle. Now, these next 3 points that I'm going to talk to you about, the Elephantine Papyri, the Samaria Papyri, and Josephus, they are not in the Bible. These are what they call external sources. When a preacher is preparing a sermon, I was a preacher for most of my life, you have internal sources, which is the Bible, and external, which are sources outside the Bible, which talk about what happened in the Bible. These other sources that I'm going to talk to you about here are external. Now, I may be a little bit over your head here, because I may be talking about some things that you've never heard before. We're going to talk about the Elephantine Papyri first, but when we get to the Samaria Papyri, you're going to think that I'm making this up. You're going to think that this is something out of Robert Ripley's Believe It or Not. I know, first time I ever heard it, that's exactly what I thought. I thought, this can't be true. But anyway, let me share something with you. The other day, I was sitting at the computer studying, preparing what I was going to talk about. My wife asked me, she said, what are you going to talk about next week? And I said, well, how do I explain this? But anyway, my wife says, well, when are you going to talk about something that we know something about? Excuse me? I said, honey, let me tell you something. Now, what I'm saying is no joke. And now, I don't mean to pick on my wife, but this is true. When I have a chance to teach, I would like to teach you something that you have never heard before. And believe me, it's not hard. Something out there that you've never heard before, like you're going to hear right here this morning, and you can take this document home and read it. But I tried to explain to my wife, would you rather me get up there and talk about something that you've heard a dozen times? Or would you rather me talk about something maybe you never heard it before, and you could learn something from it? That's my philosophy. Now, if you don't believe me, you know, we had 13 lessons in our Daniel's class before the COVID virus hit. You ask anybody in my Sunday school class if any of those 13 lessons I taught included anything they had never heard before about the book of Daniel. Well, I could talk about John 3:16. Now, I got nothing against John 3:16. I could talk about Romans 5:8. I could talk about Ephesians 2:8 and 9. I could talk about any passage of Scripture you've heard 100 times talked about. Like I said, I've got nothing against the preacher. Preach on John 3:16, the best verse of Scripture in the Bible you could preach on. But that backfired on me one day. And I didn't mean when I said it backfired, something blew up. But me and my wife went to Tennessee to visit a preacher friend of mine, a dear preacher friend of mine. He's about 10 years older than me. He's just a country preacher, has no formal education. His name's Boyd Roberts. He's been a friend of mine for many years. We went up on a Friday. We stayed the weekend. We came back on Sunday. He lives in Tennessee, Doyle, Tennessee, south of Sparta, Tennessee. If any of you from Tennessee, you might know the area. But anyway, Boyd insisted that I preach for him. And I told him, I don't have anything prepared to preach. And he said, well, preach anyway, because I know you can preach and you'll do a good job. Okay, so nothing wouldn't do him but I preached. So I was thinking, what am I going to preach on? John 3:16, okay. So time come to preach, and I said, I think I'll have some fun with the congregation. So I said, I'm going to find the youngest person in the congregation that can quote John 3:16. So I questioned everybody and found out there was the youngest person in the congregation was a little boy. He was about 6 years old. He could quote John 3:16. So I had him come forward, and he did. And I got his name. I gave him the microphone, and I said, quote John 3:16 for us. So he got the microphone, and he says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him. I didn't say a word. I just let him go on. I said, thank you, honey. You can go sit down. His only forgotten Son. You remember that, Lois? But anyway, John 3:16. You know, you'd be surprised. I wish everybody in the church knew how to read Greek. It would open your eyes. You would see things. If you could read John 3:16 in the Greek, it doesn't say, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And there's a lot of other scriptures too. The first word in John 3:16 is not for God so loved. The first word in John 3:16 is a Greek word, hutos. Hutos. It's an adjective. And it means, in this manner, in this fashion, in this method, in this way, God loved the world. What kind of way? That he gave his only begotten Son. Well, so much for that. The Elephantine Papyri, look in the middle of the page, source number 2. The Elephantine Papyri was a collection of documents that they found on Elephantine Island. Now you see the map at the bottom of the page on the left? That's Elephantine Island. It's located 600 miles it's in the middle of the Nile River, 600 miles upstream from the Nile Delta. Now, the Jews, let me make a long story short. When Nebuchadnezzar conquered the known world, he went back to Babylon and left a man in charge of the area. He gave him a title, governor. His name was Zedekiah. His name was Gedaliah. Left him in charge. Okay. A deposed member of the Jewish royal family named Ishmael and 10 other men killed him. Nice move. Now, what are they going to do? They fled for their life. They went to Egypt, and they went to this area here, 600 miles from the Nile Delta, to run and hide from Nebuchadnezzar. And they built a temple on Elephantine Island. And that temple was just like the temple in Jerusalem. Now, these people didn't realize that there was also a temple on Elephantine Island. On the next page, page 3, you'll see this handsome man. He's got the head of an ox. He is the Egyptian god Khnum. They had a temple of Khnum on that island, and they worshiped this man, had a man's body and an ox head, Well, guess what? The Jews offered animal sacrifices, and oxen was one of them. So the priests of the temple of Canaan, they destroyed the temple of the Jews. Now, the Jews wrote back to the leaders of Persia, who were the world leaders now at this time, and requested information, requested that they be allowed to rebuild their temple and that nobody bother it. And so when they wrote back to the area, they wrote back to the man in charge there in Israel that the Persians had put in charge, named Bagos, B-A-G-O-A-S, Bagos. He was the one in charge of Judea. The Persians had put him in charge. And these people, when they wrote him, they also mentioned Sanballat, the governor, in the letter. Now, on page 3 at the top of the page is a copy of this letter. It mentions Sanballat. That had to be Sanballat II. The time would not allow him to be the first or the third. The time element involved. If he had Sanballat I, he'd have been 200 years old. But anyway, the bottom line is that the Persian rulers wrote back to these people on Elephantine Island and gave them in writing permission to rebuild the temple, and nobody would bother it. And they did, and they never had any more animal sacrifices after that. So much for that. Now, the next in the middle of the page here, source number 3 is the Samaria papyri. Now, this is what's going to blow you away. I don't know what else to say. If you've ever heard, I'm not going to ask you how many of you have ever heard of the Samaria papyri. But I'm going to tell you, and you're going to think I'm making it up. You're going to think this is something out of Robert Ripley's handbook. It sounds just like it. Exactly like it. When Alexander the Great conquered the known world, he was finishing a job there in Israel. It just so happened. And he went to Egypt. And he was going to finish off with them down there, which he took Egypt without firing a shot. He set a man in charge there in Samaria named Andromachus. See number 1? The last word in number 1? He put Andromachus in charge. Well, the people in Samaria didn't like it, and the bottom line is they killed him. They burned him at the stake. Bad idea. Now, what are they going to do? They in big trouble. That's putting it mildly, brother. Alexander the Great found out. He left Egypt in haste, and he returned to Samaria. And these people, and let me say this, what I just told you about the Jews killing this man, it's not recorded by Josephus, a historian. It's recorded by another historian there were about 20 historians in that day and time. This one, his name is Quintus Curtius Rufus, book 4, page 70. I have that book that tells about it. Okay, the Jews, fleeing the wrath of Alexander, traveled south and found refuge in a cave 9 miles north of Jericho. It's in an area called the Wadi Ed Dalia. The name of the cave that they went in was called Marguerite Abu Shinja. Now, the Macedonian army was able to track them down because it was about 100 people and their relatives. And they had all the supplies with them when they left Samaria, and they fled, and they went south, and they found this cave 10 miles north of Jericho, and they went in that cave, and they thought they were secure. Well, the Macedonian army tracked them down and found them, and they put a huge bonfire in front of that cave, the mouth of that cave, and it suffocated them to death. Dennis, you can put the picture on the screen. I sent Dennis a picture and had him to put it on the screen. This is the entrance to the cave, 10 miles north of Jericho, in the Wadi Ed Dalia, that these 100 people and their relatives, their children, they went in, they had their supplies with them, they were all fully clothed, and they had everything they would need to survive, and they went into that cave, and the Macedonian army put a bonfire in front of it, and it killed them. And they left. Now remember, this was in 331 BC. 331 BC. Okay. The Samaritan people had with them over 100 documents. That's why they call it the Samaria Papyri. I've got a book here that tells the whole story. This book here is called The Annual of the American Schools of Oriental Research, Volume 41. This book costs $300. I shouldn't say that with my wife here. Here's a picture. Here's a picture of one of the letters, the papyrus that they had. Now, these letters and papyrus and scrolls they had, they told about the sale of slaves, the deed to marriage certificates, this kind of stuff. But and they also found in the pockets of the people 6 coins. You think that didn't get my attention? One of the coins that they found was a coin, the Athena tetradrachma, which I talked about when I taught the lesson on the coins. That was one of them. And they, this book here is a whole documentary. This book here has got pictures. It's got pictures, diagrams, charts. It's got everything about what they found. There's a picture of the young man in here who found the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's a grown man. That was in 1962. But anyway, this cave was discovered. The Bedouin from the tribe of the Tamaric Bedouins discovered this cave here in 1962. Now, here's what the Robert Ripley thing comes in. Those people stayed in that cave. They suffocated to death in 331 BC. They weren't discovered until 1962. 2,284 years later. And they went in and they excavated it. This book here tells all about the excavation, the men and women who were involved. It was a young man named Paul Lapp. He was an archaeologist. He was 39 years old. He was killed. He was drowned. Him and 2 friends were swimming on the north shore of the island of Cyprus, and an undertow pulled them under. 2 of the men were able to escape, and Paul Lapp was pulled underneath and drowned. He was 39 years old. His picture's in this book. And his wife, Nancy, is still a practicing archaeologist, one of the most well-known ones in the whole state of Israel. But they found it, and all of these documents that they found talked about Sanballat, the governor. This was the Sanballat II, who ruled during the time of the Persian kings. Not the Greek kings, because the Greek kings were just getting ready to take over. There was only about 18, you see number 7 there at the next bottom, 8's the last item in this Samaria Papyri. Only 18 of the documents were readable. Now, on the next page, page 4, the historian Josephus talks about Sanballat III. Now, on pages 4 and 5, I have put the entire chapter of the book of Josephus here, so you can read it. Now, we ain't going to read it this morning. We don't have time. But I'm going to tell you what's in there briefly, just a sketch of it, okay? Now, this was the fourth source for the Sanballat. This was Sanballat III that Josephus talks about. When Alexander the Great discovered the known world, erase that. When Alexander the Great conquered the known world, he was finishing up in Israel. Okay? Now, when Josephus writes about that here in this, what I put in here, Josephus, book 11, chapter 8, Josephus records that Alexandria came into Israel. Now, when you come into Israel, you come into Samaria first. Alexander met Sanballat when he came into Israel. That is Sanballat III. And he talked to Sanballat. And Alexander the Great was trying to capture the island of Tyre. You've heard of Tyre and Sidon? Okay. He was having a hard time defeating the island of Tyre because it was so well fortified. It was a little island there offshore about a quarter of a mile. Listen, when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Israel, he could not take the island of Tyre. He went back home and forgot about it. He said, it ain't worth it. Leave it out there and forget it. Nebuchadnezzar could not take the island of Tyre. That's something you never heard, I bet. But anyway, Alexander, he spent 7 months fighting these people, and he finally took it. And when he met Sanballat, Sanballat gave him 7,000 soldiers to be members of his army. And it pleased Alexander greatly, and Alexander the Great asked him what favors he would like to have in return. He said he wanted to build a temple on Mount Gerizim, just like the temple that was in Jerusalem. And Alexander the Great let him do it. That was in 331 BC, and that temple lasted until the year 105 BC when a Hasmonean prince named, I forgot his name. One of the Hasmonean princes destroyed it. John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus II destroyed that temple on Mount Gerizim. He wanted to just get rid of all the Samaritans. Okay, now, Alexander went down into Jerusalem, going south, and he met with the people. The Jews knew he was coming. The priests put on their priestly garb, and they went out to meet Alexander, who was coming. They heard he was coming. The high priest had on his high priest garb. It was purple. The other priests had on white. They were dancing with their timbrels, and they went out to meet Alexander the Great. They made a circle around him, and Alexander the Great bowed down to him. And the people that were witnessing thought Alexander had lost his mind. They thought Alexander would have killed him, but he didn't. And he was on friendly terms with them. These Jews took Alexander the Great inside the temple. They showed Alexander the Great the book of Daniel, where it says in there that he would be the next king of the world after the Persian king. It came to pass, just like Daniel said, and Josephus said this pleased Alexander greatly. Now, I don't know where they showed him in Daniel. I don't know what passage they showed him. It's in the book of Daniel 3 times. Chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 11. Probably showed him chapter 11. But anyway, Alexander was pleased, and he asked the Jews, "What can I do for you?" The Jews said, "Allow us to continue the worship of our fathers, just like they have done for years, and let us be relieved and pay no taxes to the state every 7th year." And Alexander the Great granted their request. And also, let me throw this in. This is in the document. Everything I'm telling you is in this document right here. You can take it home and read it when you get time. And if you got any question about it, I'll be glad for you to ask me. But anyway, when Alexander the Great approached this group of men, these priests that came out to meet him, Alexander the Great said he had a dream previously, some time back, and the dream that he had was very similar to what he was seeing with these Jews. And the high priest was a man named Jaddua at the time. You see on page, let's see the last page in the document? There's a list of high priests there. And I tell a story about, on the last page here, that I'm not going to go into detail this morning because time's about gone anyway, but how the high priest, when Antiochus Epiphanes in 175 BC became the world ruler, he started selling the high priesthood to the highest bidder. So when this happened, Onias, who was the high priest, who had been deposed by a man who bought the high priesthood from Alexander, he left with a group of people, and they went to Egypt, and they built a temple in Leontopolis, Egypt. Here's a picture of it here. That's in the Nile Delta. Well, I hope that I haven't been too far over your head. I hope I haven't confused you, but I don't know. You remember a man named Paul Harvey? He used to. I loved to listen to him. And he would come on air every day at 12 o'clock, and he's dead now. He died. And he would tell his story. And at the end of his story, he would always say, "And now you know the rest of the story."